Section 6 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 6. Batson secured work in a machine shop, working day and night upon airplane fittings, one of the thousands throughout the country. He had not been compelled to undertake this work. Though the whole nation was at the disposal of its chosen rulers, there was no need of compulsion. The crisis was too dire and imminent to breed laggards. Wages were non-existent, and cash payments, except for certain minor luxuries apart from foodstuffs, fuel, and transportation, were abolished. Thus all, rich and poor, were practically on the same level, a policy which went far to bind the nation into one cohesive unit. But daily the rations were narrowing, and the weird deadly growths increasing. Though in the struggle to exterminate them, untold numbers were destroyed by the numerous bands of men and women detailed for that purpose, yet it was like trying to mop up the incoming tide with a sponge. By the 20th of the month, the people of the British Isles had realized that now only a miracle could save the nation from extinction. On land, there was not a county, a district, or hardly a square mile, where the terrible things could not be found, in every wood and hedgerow, in vast numbers. Worn with the hopeless work and impoverished in brain and body, the people nevertheless fought grimly on, determined to die fighting, as is the habit of English-speaking humanity. But hope was dead. The great drift, encircling the islands, flowed ever inward, each tide spewing up its millions to swell the awful ridge. Only at the mouths of the rivers was this ridge missing. Here the growths invariably parted to left and right. Directly the influence of the fresh water might be presumed to extend. For some reason they abhorred fresh water, and would not advance a foot within it, for all of their desperate striving to attain the land. The theory was advanced that, in the planet of their origin, the land was in the process of emerging from the waters, as once, some millions of years gone by, our own continent slowly arose. Probably in this primeval world, sailing channels and sloughs extended over the greater portion of this low-lying land, forming vast, water-sogged wastes. Here it was likely this rapacious life found a congenial spawning ground, or, again, it might be that this was their larder, for here in the warm water and mud would be a teeming life, almost inexhaustible. Whatever the origin, it could only be some hereditary instinct which drove them landward so inexorably. On the never-to-be-forgotten 25th day of August, Batson wearily trudged to his work. For breakfast he had munched his 4 ounces of bread, 9/10 of which was husks and chemically treated straw, and 1/10 flour, composed of a dozen different grains. Butter had vanished from the dietary almost from the first day of rationing. Jams and canned preserves had held out until a few days ago. Tea and coffee were still in evidence, though every grain was now boiled until it no longer tinted the water. 1 ounce of lard per day, and a weekly allowance of a pound of gristle or bone, as luck would have it, lent a faint aroma to the mockery of a meal, but even this, they had been warned, would in a day or two be missing, and the bread dole would cease in less than a week's time. Experiments had been made with every possible material which might be a source of food supply. Even the cause of all this suffering, the awful growths on sea and land, had been essayed as a means of sustaining life, but they were found to be most deleterious in the smallest quantities, and in larger, actively poisonous, those partaking being attacked with severe internal pains, ending in partial paralysis and coma. The nation was entering its last few days of existence, and the people, in hopeless despair, awaited the end. Already in other countries less efficiently organized and lacking the Anglo-Saxon stolidity of temperament, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, had perished. There was no telling accurately, so disrupted were the usual means of tabulating vital statistics. In the New World, conditions, though sufficiently grave, had as yet brought no serious suffering or peril to the people. Possessing vast internal sources of the raw necessaries of life, the people of the United States and Canada were in no immediate danger. In the United States, the nation had arisen as one man and demanded that their entire resources and efforts should be devoted to the alleviation and succor, as far as humanly possible, of their stricken fellow men. The air fleet, already the largest in the world, and possessing craft capable of transporting 100 passengers across the Atlantic, were even now racing on their homeward trip from the British Isles, loaded to the limit with fleeing humanity fortunate enough to obtain passage. For while all the fleets of the world could not have fed a moiety of those starving millions, yet a certain number might be snatched from the very jaws of death. Already several thousand had been so transported. Seats in these craft were obtained by ballot, a district being allotted to each vessel as it appeared, the seats having been previously drawn for. Thus there was not a moment's delay, and 4 days after leaving their home coast they had returned and were disgorging their human freight, among which the millionaire and the meanest beggar were shipmates. Thousands of aircraft were being feverishly assembled in every state of the Union by men who worked until they dropped at their machines, and waiting men snatched the tools from their hands without a belt being slipped. The horror of the merciless slaying of a nation, people akin to them in blood and speech, had gripped the humblest worker in the land and controlled his every thought and action. That these aircraft could never be used before the awful tragedy was consummated was realized, yet men had to work. The human brain would not stand the terror of thought in idleness. Batson, on that 25th day of August, had worked steadily through the morning, dully, hopelessly, but doggedly. He knew that death was but a few days from him, yet his own dissolution had the edge of its awe blunted by the enormity of the catastrophe. Probably few in these latter days were supremely concerned over their own little portion in the fast approaching finale. The magnitude of the thing overwhelmed the ego, but the common people, such as Batson, though he would have indignantly repudiated the offensive classification, were sick of the waiting and suspense. Therefore, though the work on the craft went ahead with all dispatch, the spirit of the workers had no share in it. The 12 o'clock whistle was on the point of sounding, when through the hum of the big lays broke a swelling roar of human voices. So silent had been the huge city of late that the unwonted commotion aroused in him an interest out of all proportion to the event. Deliberately he drew back the lever which broke the couplings of his machine to the main shaft. His neighbors, encouraged by his lead, followed suit. The foreman came striding up with a fierce query in his hard eyes. Batson held up his hand and beckoned for silence, which was a piece of impudence for even a voluntary worker. But the light of battle faded from the foreman's eye, and he remained in a posture of intense alertness. The drone of the lays no longer intervening, the full volume of the distant cheering came through the open windows with startling import. For it was cheering, salvo after salvo of unrestrained emotion, sustained, swelling, no listener could miss the note of enthusiasm and tense joy which pulsed in the sound. As they stood, mute and wondering, the sound drew nearer, as though thousands closer had caught the infection. "What the dickens?" queried Batson of no one in particular. "By Jove, what?" remarked his neighbor. "Who the hell?" ejaculated his mate. Then, without another word, in a second the open door was jammed with struggling men. In a staggering knot they reached the street. From every door similar little crowds were being shot forth. At the end of the street, several blocks away, a man appeared in the center of the road. He was running madly, hatless, coatless, arms waving, and as he ran he was shouting vociferously in a shrill falsetto which carried to them clearly, "Praise the Lord of Judah! We're saved! Are going to hell!" And some other things he bawled, but they were so interlarded with inconsequent profanity that they conveyed no meaning. Likely enough he was a decent family man, but now he was for the time merely a foul-mouthed lunatic. As the watchers stared, the cheering came racing to them, spreading fan-wise in every direction. Street after street, block after block, the frenzy of sound was growing rapidly into the roar of millions of delirious humanity. None could resist the call of that mad joy, and in a moment the cobbled street was clanging with the racing feet of hundreds, drawn by the infection of that high emotion. And suddenly they found themselves surrounded by a throng of dancing, singing, yelling maniacs. Or apparently they were, for men were revolving rapidly in the embrace of other men, progressing in an impromptu waltz, obviously indifferent and unaware of any known objective. Others were throwing aloft their headgear and coats, and yelling with mirth as they witnessed them fall to be instantly stamped underfoot by their companions. Many were insanely fighting with both foot and fist, though, lacking the will which usually accompanies such efforts, no great damage seemed to result. And amidst the bedlam of noise and motion, there arose high-pitched callings on the name of their author, bawlings of intense emotion, even supreme adoration. Women with dishevelled tresses and staring eyes, some singing, some praying in hysterical fervors, many with tears streaming down their flushed cheeks, ran by the side of the men. The majority of these women could be classed at a glance. Their trade had stamped them ineffaceably, harpies and harlots of the lowest type, women whose emotions had never known the leash of spiritual control. Nevertheless, not one but was swayed at the moment by an intense joy which was not entirely selfish or ignoble. "Here!" exclaimed Batson, catching hold of a small man who, laughing foolishly, was engaged most successfully in grinding underfoot a hard felt hat. "What the deuce is the racket about? Are you all gone loony, or what?" "Hooray! Hooray!" bawled his prisoner, squirming in his grasp. "Stop it!" yelled Batson heatedly, "or I'll biff you one on the snout." And his tone must have carried conviction, for the man eyed him with distinct apprehension, and replied sensibly enough, "Who are you talking to? Just try it on. Ain't you heard the news? We're saved. They're going to wipe these bloody things out. The Yank has fixed up some chemical poison. It's sure death to them. All in the newspapers. Let go my arm, you blarsted fool!" And he wrenched himself free, shouting as he ran, "Hooray! Hooray!" "It's the bloody truth," said a young, brazenly good-looking girl who had been coolly watching the incident, evidently in expectation of witnessing a vigorous rough and tumble. "The little bloke's right. Sort of a plague like. They'll fade out same as snow in hell. They got it in print on the boards. I seen it myself. Praise Gord, we're saved!" she suddenly and most fervently shrieked. For some little while that was the last distinct impression he received. He had a hazy idea that he was dancing and yelling with the best of them, grinning vapidly in other men's faces, and thumping their backs as hard as they thumped his. Also many other curious and unwanted motions he probably indulged in, but over these the veil of memory is mercifully opaque and very discreet. Though for the moment the astounding news he had just heard was lacking the slightest confirmatory evidence, yet the very abruptness and simplicity of the statement carried an immediate acceptance to his starved nerve centers, which long had thirsted and craved for just such a moment. He must, however, have retained a degree of control over his movements, for presently he found that he had reached the vicinity of the publishing district, which in London is so strangely compact. Enormous throngs were gathered there, waiting until they could secure a copy from the endless cataract of single sheets the vast presses were pouring forth. In the course of time, a very much torn and disgustingly dirty copy drifted into his hands. This immediately vanished into his breast pocket, and by dint of strenuous labor he finally emerged on the outskirts of the dense jam and eventually arrived at his rooms. There he devoured every smudged and half obliterated word, read of the young American medico, no less or worse an American for the fact that his parents had, prior to his birth, migrated from an unspellable village in Lower Silesia, a brilliant student of bacteriology in one of the great laboratories, young Paul Steenhorst, working upon original lines of his own devising, made the discovery which saved the human species from inevitable extinction, and himself, incidentally, became the most famous man the world has ever known. There was no lack of material to experiment upon. Planes with grappling iron and hook were constantly fishing from the abominable raffle individuals which were immediately forwarded in large tanks to the now nationalized laboratories all over the country. Failure after failure had attended the efforts of the most highly specialized brains in the nation. To the rankly virulent bacilli of cholera, typhus, even plague and anthrax, these alien growths, while by no means immune, yet betrayed no greater susceptibility than the average human being in a civilized sanitary environment, and the progress of the infection would probably, in both cases, run a very similar course, a brief period of maximum vigor when the fatalities might number some 10%. There was no reason, however, to expect that even this slight measure of offense would result in more than a mere local activity, or be of the slightest practical value to the starving world. But Steenhorst, divinely inspired as many held, alighted by a devious route upon the Micrococcus phosphorans bacilli, a marine species of bacteria and the origin of the occasional phosphorescence of a few of the lesser crustacea. Unlike the bacilli of the common phosphorescence, which is harmless to its living habitation, the phosphorans produced in the blood of the victims a chemical change, which caused its rapid decease. The powers and speed of propagation of this species of bacteria bordered on the incomprehensible. Moreover, for some unknown cause, the victims of its deadly malignity were confined solely to the most insignificant order of crustacea, to which belonged the common sandhopper and its near relatives. Yet from the first hour of its introduction to the tanks, there could be no doubt of its virulent activity in this strange nutrient medium. Its rapidity of growth and avidity of attack were astounding. In less than an hour, luminous patches could be distinctly traced in the frightful monsters, when all light was excluded from the infected tank, and in a couple of hours the whole mass of each horrible captive was glowing as though painted with a coat of phosphorus, and betraying an intense unrest, as evidenced by the violent weaving in and out of their tentacles and the incessant contracting and relaxing of their frond-like appendages. But shortly the motion had ceased, and in shapeless inert heaps they floated just below the surface, while their luminosity was now greatly increased, in spite of the fact that they had ceased to exist. A hasty microscopic examination, by men whose cold fingers actually trembled as they prepared the slides, revealed the complete destruction of the molecular structure of their circulating fluid by countless billions of bacilli. And even as these men of science stared at one another, with a dawning comprehension of the message they had now to give to the world, even on the slides, in the tank, before their eyes commenced that astounding disintegration, a thing without parallel in experience, so rapid was the process of decay in these growths. They appeared to be falling apart and vanishing as the astonished men stared. Whole segments of tentacles became detached and fell away, and in their turn subdivided again and again, until all that could be distinguished was a vivid scarlet-hued area of sluggish liquid. For in the final stages of disintegration some chemical reaction occurred, which tinted the putrescence of brilliant scarlet. From start to finish, the entire course of dissolution had not occupied more than 4 hours, so rapidly continuous had been its progress. That the solution of the problem had been attained, there could be little doubt. But was there yet time to save the teeming millions of Europe, now trembling on the brink of the last bottomless chasm? They could but try, and even as Batson read the bare outlines of these matters, airplanes were swarming above the horde lying just outside of New York, where the appalling nightmare of alien life had been arrested in their shoreward flow by the fresh water debouching there. Hovering and swooping like huge mosquito hawks, those voracious winged tigers of the insect world, they almost brushed that densely packed, hideous surface as they dropped the contents of many little vials upon the seething mass. It might appear to the unlearned masses, could they have witnessed the action, that it was but the play of a child straining to arrest the incoming tide with his tiny breastwork of sand. But the possessors of the far-seeing and thoughtful eyes, which scanned the enormous drift from the rear of many an airplane, knew that, upon the outcome of this silent little bombardment, depended the fate of hundreds of millions of their fellow beings, and in a few hours these quiet, self-contained watchers knew that humanity had once again justified itself and retained the mastership of the world, had vanquished the enemy, even as our prehistoric ancestors had overcome the terrors which threatened them. For wherever the culture had been released, there shortly the movement of the growths became accelerated and troubled, and patches of phosphorescent light gleamed in the depths exposed by the upflung, flogging tentacles. Later these spaces of agitated activity subsided, grew vague in outline, clouded, and finally developed the brilliant scarlet hue. Then, once again, these dead areas were refilled by the surrounding thousands. But the verdict had been pronounced, and again the process would be repeated, ever more rapidly, to speed on their mission the tiny messengers of death. And now, in 100 laboratories throughout the country, the deadly culture was being prepared, and roaring airplanes were rushing to them, a stream of the already infected horrible growths. End of section 6.